What's up, guys? I'm Jim from HMC Knives, and I wanted to take a quick minute to make a video going over how to properly disassemble and clean your folding knife. So there's a few things that I like to have when I'm doing this. They're pretty simple, and I think a lot of custom knife enthusiasts also have the same array of items, but I like to have a couple of drivers. This is a T15 Torx bit. I have a T8 here, and then I also have a second T15. This actually is just a small driver for holding the second side of the Torx in place. Some knives have a captive pivot that on one side prevents it from spinning. The Transient does not. So in some instances, you will not need two drivers, but for the Transient with a Loctited pivot, you will need two. So the first thing that you're going to do is you're going to disassemble the pivot. On all Transients, the knife is assembled from the lock side first, so the show side pivot is going to be the preferred pivot to remove. A lot of people go the other direction, but this is the way that I do it. So you're going to want to hold the pivot screw in place from this direction, and on this side, break this free. You will remove the pivot screw, take your T8, and remove the two backspacer screws. From here, I like to partially open the blade. In this case, the show scale popped right off because of the tension from the lock bar. Some will not do that, and you may have to shimmy the show scale off. Gather your bearings, remove your blade, and then remove the stop pin, push the pivot through the other side, remove your bearings. And it's up to you if you want to remove the pocket clip and the backspacer. In some cases, the pocket clip may need additional tensioning if you've maybe hit it on something and it needs to be bent back. In this case of the Transient, there is no space underneath the backspacer for dust to collect, so I'm not going to remove it, but you can if you want to. So the first step would be to remove any debris from within the bearing counterbore and to clean any gunk or grime that you have off of the lock face here. So I usually just take a microfiber towel so they don't leave any lint behind, and I will just wipe off those surfaces. This is a new knife. In all likelihood, go through and I would clean the internal pocketing, get anything out of the stop pin that I need to. In some instances, it's advantageous to use a Q-tip just to get into tighter areas. I like to have them on hand because, you know, sometimes that's a pertinent thing. And so as far as reassembly goes, you'll pretty much just go in reverse. I guess I should take a step back. With regard to the blade, critical places that you want to inspect are going to be the stop pin track and the pivot hole. A lot of times on these internal stop pin knives, pocket lint and other debris will get inside of the half moon stop pin track. And so I like to take a Q-tip and just get it in there and make sure that I remove anything that would be within there. Do the same in the pivot. Getting out any old lubrication that you may have, as well as any dust or grime that may have worked its way in. In all likelihood, with a tight pivot tolerance, nothing will have gotten into the pivot hole, but maybe when you remove the pivot, it may have drugged something through. So we always want to make sure and clean that also. The same can be said for the show side. You go ahead and clean out any of the internal pocketing, the stop pin hole, or the bearing counterbore itself. So now, as far as reassembly goes, it's relatively simple. You would, if you took off, you'd reassemble the backspacer and the pocket clip. The pivot re-enters the pivot hole. The next thing I like to do is put my stop pin back in. One side of the bearings, I will take a lubricant. In this case, this is nano oil. There's knife pivot lube. There's a whole array of different knife lubricants that you can use. But I like to put a few drops on my bearings, not too much, and I'll put a little line on the pivot itself. At this point, a lot of people have a tendency to just want to slather a bunch of lubricant on the detent ball. I don't like to do this, and the reason is because when the detent ball in the surrounding frame is slathered in oil, it has a tendency to carry onto the lock face, and if the lock face gets covered in oil, a lot of times that will cause lock stick. And I also don't like to put any pivot lubricant directly on the detent hole itself, because when the ball drops into that hole, the frame has a tendency to come close to hitting the blade there, which can then grab oil, which will then bleed onto the lock face and cause a similar issue. So I like to just put 2 drops. One, if you're picturing this as a clock, and noon is up here and 6 o'clock is down here, I like to put a little drop on the detent track here at like 4 o'clock, and then I like to put one over here at like 7 o'clock. Those are actually pretty big dots. I usually would not put that much, but this little bottle here is leaking, so I'm actually going to remove that, and I'm going to do the same thing, but just make 2 small dots. That way the detent ball can ride through those, and the small contact point of the detent ball to get the lubrication it needs without carrying it to the lock face. Anyhow, we will then take the blade, replace it onto the pivot, take the other bearing, and put a little bit of lubrication on it as well, spinning it around as we put it on. We will take the show side frame, stop pin, and then pivot. Take our pivot barrel. At this point, you would apply a little bit of new Loctite, just a very little bit of new blue Loctite. I like to tighten it down just to where it stops for now, and then I'll replace the screws in the back spacer. And I will then check the blade for centering, which it's nice and centered. And I will also then check the blade for blade play. So we want to see up here, we can move our blade. If we can move our blade back and forth, if we feel any play, at that time we would add a little bit of tension to the pivot, very, very small amount, and then recheck, and we have no blade play. I am not a fan of just locking the pivot screws down. I think that puts undue pressure on the assembly stack up of the pivot and bearings and everything itself. I like to just tighten it to the point where everything is smooth and nothing is loose. And then it's very important at that point to allow your Loctite to set up for a few hours. If not, there's a good chance that the pivots will back off, the blade will become loose, things will become uncentered. So once you reassemble your knife, before you start flicking it over and over it again, give it a chance to set up. That's your basic disassembly and cleaning video for the Transient. I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll catch up with you later. Take care.